So, it's funny, when I was at Bentley, first off, I had an amazingly great experience at Bentley. Um, in particular, in my beginning of my sophomore, was it my sophomore, beginning of my junior year, into my sophomore year, I had a part-time job. I got through Bentley writing software for a company and a small investment firm. And I realized I kind of fell in love with being a software engineer. I started writing software, and it's funny now, the things you take for granted, but back in the day, I basically automated all their stock portfolios. They used to have about 100 customers, but they could only update their portfolios like quarterly because it took so long. So anyways, long story short, I updated them nightly, and they grow exponentially. But for me, I kind of like fell in love, and I realized that that's kind of what I really wanted to do. And it's kind of funny because I was a full-time employee while I was a full-time student my last 2 years. And but what it did though is it made my courses all the more relevant for me. I really kind of, everything was kind of a bit of a kind of a means to an end in terms of how it was going to prepare me for my career. So anyway, so I worked early on with a couple small investment companies. I later writing software, mostly software development and designing systems and product engineering. I went to Stop and Shop companies, did the same thing there, headed up a small team of developers, did that for a couple of years, and then went to Wang Labs. And most of you probably don't even know Wang Labs, but I'll tell you a funny story. Wang, in many respects, I do a lot of work with Google, and Wang was kind of a little bit like Google before Google, believe it or not. It was, when I was there, I spent half my time writing software for their networking division and heading up a team of developers, and the other half I kind of worked in R&D, designing software, and I loved it. And it was funny. I used to sometimes get reprimanded because they wanted you to spend 90% of your time working and 10% of your time thinking about new ideas. And I mean, incredibly innovative at the time. They had a lot of other things that were very progressive way back in the day. But long story short, as sort of a software person, I left there and I went to Scudder Stevens and Clark mutual fund company. It was a large mutual fund company at the time. It ultimately became Scudder Kemper, but I worked there for about 7 years in Boston, and I headed up software development for them, and later became their CTO. And I'm going to share this briefly with you, but just to give you a little bit of my background, so you kind of know where I kind of come from. So I've always kind of had a focus on sort of innovation and design and engineering. And Scudder was an amazing opportunity for me. Got an opportunity to work with a lot of people. It's the first time I really kind of also kind of managed large volumes of people, both here in New York. I left there and I went out with, if you know, Meg Whitman, formerly with eBay and others. So Meg Whitman was from Boston. So Meg and I and a few others went out to FTD to kind of take FTD from a nonprofit to a for-profit model. So kind of worked there with some private equity companies like Bain, and worked out there for a couple of years. And that was another amazing journey. And I'll kind of weave all this into kind of my little story, but I was there for a couple of years before I went to the Weather Channel. And the Weather Channel is probably where, I had an opportunity to sort of really sort of align all these things I've learned in one organization. And I got there in late 98, the fall of 98. And I worked there till like 2012, 13, 12, I guess. And I'll tell you about that journey because it was an amazing journey. Literally, my first day at the Weather Channel, I'll tell you a true story. And this goes in the category of, by the way, asking the right questions when you interview. My first day at the Weather Channel, I was a big kind of data guy. I haven't worked at some of these investment companies and things. And I went to the Weather Channel, and my first day, I went to the head of meteorology, and I said, "Oh, we must have so much data on forecasting and everything else. Like, how far back does our data go?" And I remember what he said. He said, "Well, why would I want to save a forecast?" And I said, "Well, I'll take that question." I said, "Because we want to learn from it." And literally, that became the first day that we stored everything at the Weather Channel. And subsequently, when we ended up selling it to IBM at one point, someone did ask me one time why all the data there kind of started in August of 98. That was kind of the reason. It was also a little bit horrifying for me to find out that we were a little bit behind the eight ball there. And I've been the Red Sox for 7 great years, 2 World Series, hopefully more in the horizon. And I'll tell you, obviously, I'll kind of weave all these different places into it, because as you kind of go through your own career, and many of you are still in college and trying to figure out different things, but as you go through your career, I'm going to share with you. I originally was going to talk a bit about kind of lessons learned a little bit, but I'm going to give you a bit more of the journey part and things that you might want to expect. And only because I've got, three kids. I don't have the kids anymore, but they're all in their early 20s. I've got one will be graduating next month from college, and that'll be my third. So part of what I'll share with you is what I've shared with them, and also with some of our employees, especially our younger employees. So hopefully this will turn out to be some best practices that you guys can help you guide you on your respective careers. So let me just kind of dive into his journey. So 10 things that I'll just kind of go through. So that first job, understanding your company, its culture, the workplace is changing, developing good listening skills, mentors, learning from mistakes, complacency. All these things for me are kind of like the tenets upon which, I sort of both try to manage my own career and frankly, in some respects, encourage others within our organization or the organizations I've worked for to kind of do as well. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more kind of what these all are. And I hope it'll kind of resonate with all of you. So that first job. So it sounds like most of you aren't there yet, which is great because you're in school. That's cool. The thing that's really important, though, I think, when you kind of get out there and you're starting to have that first job conversation, is something like I've hired like thousands of people in my career, and it's interesting. When I get new students, sorry, well, I guess if former students, new employees, I oftentimes find they don't really know what to expect oftentimes. Now I will say, since I graduated from college, I think colleges do a much, much better job of preparing students for what that world's like, internships and co-ops and other sort of things at universities. I think have done a great job of that. But the thing I really kind of emphasize for folks is so much of it's about effort. Like we're all different. We all have different skills, and whether we're applying it to sports or academics or even frankly work, I mean, so much of it is the amount of energy and effort that you kind of put into that job. And I think the challenge that I see sometimes with young adults is that they're somewhat cautious, and that's kind of makes sense, right? You're kind of new. You want to sort of like listen first and maybe speak a little bit less than you might otherwise potentially. But I would encourage you to really, kind of like dive right in. What companies are looking for now is changed. When I was graduating and worked at some big companies, it was very common that we had these education programs. They would sort of take you through the culture of the company and indoctrinate you on the do's and don'ts and tell you about sort of like, how people are, evaluated and, the organizational structure and how we make money and who our competition is, all these things. By the way, I almost know no company that does that anymore. I'm sure there are large scale, Fortune 100 companies that do that, but most companies nowadays, employees start in their, and the orientation programs are pretty lean definitely in comparison to, the old days, so to speak. And so I think that's not a good thing in my mind. What it does is it puts an added premium on leaders in companies, but also on you guys to try to, kind of skate to where the puck is, so you need to kind of almost go in there with some expectations a little bit about how you're going to succeed and the level of effort that you can commit and, learning and how you can sort of, get to understand the company and its culture. And I'll talk about some of those things in a couple of minutes, but it's really kind of about putting in the effort, because once you've kind of established yourself, I think, things tend to just sort of flow pretty naturally, assuming you're one of those kind of people who kind of embraces change. And that's another important characteristic that's changed since I graduated. I mean, I love change. It's kind of what gets me up in the morning. It's kind of what I've always enjoyed in my jobs. A lot of people don't, though, right? A lot of people, they learn a certain profession and they just want it to be the same. They kind of want to go in and it's the same. And there are a lot of jobs where that's fine. That's not a lot of CIS jobs, and it's not data, and it's not analytics. So as I tell groups, that I've been working at, I said, if you chose this field thinking it wasn't going to change, you made a big mistake. So it's never changed more quickly, and COVID is just the latest, most recent great example of that. Second thing I just wanted to mention is understanding your company and its culture. And it's a great, quote from Peter Drucker, management consulting: "A culture eats strategy for lunch." Too often, I think, employees don't understand their own culture and understand kind of like what makes that company who it is. And it's funny when you're on an executive committee level, you spend a lot of time talking about the culture of your business, in terms of like, what do we want to emphasize? Like in this new world with COVID, as we return probably to a bit more of a hybrid world, how does that affect our culture? Like, how does it impact new employees? Do they have the same passions that they had before? And so one of the things I would encourage you to do is really kind of lean in on these issues, because it's too often that people sort of find that they try to understand the strategy of the company without fully understanding sort of the culture. And I'll give you a great example. So at the Red Sox, I mean, what we're all about is, baseball is kind of this timeless pastime. It's about, for me, it's about kind of preserving what's best in baseball while leveraging what's best in technology. And I think too often you have to kind of understand that dichotomy sometimes. The Weather Channel I mentioned earlier, when I got there in 98, we were just launched weather.com. And for those that are technically, inclined, like it didn't even have a firewall back in the day when we first launched it. And so there were so many things that we had to learn. But as we kind of evolved from like, when I first got there, if you ask somebody like, what is a Weather Channel? They would say a cable network. And when I left there, if someone said, who are they? They would say they're a technology company. Now, not very few companies go through that sort of metamorphosis in the time period that we did. That's very rare, but it's important, I think, for you to all to kind of understand sort of the companies are not static. They don't stay the same. Even if they look the same on the outside, they're very radically different on the inside. And I'll tell you a funny story. So we bring in a lot of different students, to kind of work with us, internships and things like that. And one I always think of is we had some student in from Northeastern one time, mechanical engineering student, and we were talking about projects that we could work on. And Northeastern has a capstone project where they they have to work on something in a small team, and he was super passionate and fired up. And I said, so what's your idea? And he goes, let's automate the scoreboard. And I was like, yeah, that seems like a really good idea, except for like the millions of Red Sox fans who would think that's a really horrible idea. So we, and so again, I say it only in jest, but it's a great example of understanding sort of like where you can apply your trade, and obviously because this is the Red Sox, we're one of those companies, for those that are fans, where, we operate the oldest ballpark in baseball that's been around since 1912. And I think what people are sometimes amazed about is, that was, we had our first game by basically a week after the Titanic sank. So to give you a little bit of perspective about sort of kind of old Fenway Park is. But what's interesting, and especially when you think about it relative to culture, is you would think Fenway Park from the outside might look remarkably similar, but it's radically different as a business. So it continues to change. That Bud deck's not there, that's a sand deck now. And right now, if you're looking at that view, you'd be looking at sort of some of the construction going on with our Fenway Music Hall. But we host major games. We've got a bowl game now every December. So an ESPN bowl game, you'll be hearing more. We do concerts, as you can imagine. This is our big air event and things like that. We announced last year that we're going to develop 2 million square feet of real estate around Fenway Park. And that's going to be things from mixed use to, probably office, restaurants, maybe a hotel, we'll see, type of thing. So a lot of change going on for a company that's been around a long time. And again, the challenge is like, how do you preserve all this while maintaining the best of the past? This is sort of our music hall. This is going to launch in the fall of next year. And for those that go to a game this year, the other side of this overlooks the bleachers. So it's, we're in transition, and those transitions are awesome, and they're exciting. And I think it's, but it's for all of us, it's important just to kind of know your company, know its strategy, and understand its culture in order to kind of align your skills for success. The workplace is changing. So this is, I know this is not lost to most people, but COVID has had an unbelievable impact on corporations. And I speak at a lot of different CIO events. And when I spend time with my peers and we talk about these things, it's a major transformational challenge for many of us. A lot of companies are going to like hoteling, right? So you don't even have your own space anymore, right? You sort of share it. You tell them when you want to kind of come to the office, and we'll make sure you've got an area where you can work, right? And what that does though is it puts challenges in puts stresses on certain portions. If you think that for almost 100 years we had offices in cubes, and now we've got open areas, and we've got hybrid people, and some are at home and some are at work, and you've got managers who have to manage this sort of diverse workforce. And I think having a diverse workforce is great. And I think it's absolutely kind of the wave of the future, and for companies that kind of embrace change. And but it also creates challenges, many challenges for a lot of us. And I think if you're taking a technology path, one of the challenges too is that leaders, like maybe my generation in certain cases, most of them, a lot of them still don't have complete comfort with where they kind of can't count heads, right? They grew up sort of in an era where everybody was in one place, or they might have different offices scattered around, but they didn't work virtually historically. And so we're kind of going through this transition of how do you lead when, people are sort of in multiple places? And how do I'll tell you one of the things that's a big challenge in our company, and my peers in the New England area would say the same thing too, which is, we spend a lot of our time innovating. We whiteboard, we think about things, we design new solutions to problems, we try to create a better, improved fan experience. That's like really difficult to do online. There are tools and whiteboarding products, but it's not the same. And so as the workplace is changing, you're going to have to become a little bit more, flexible than I think your average employee was in terms of how you operate. Now, that's a little bit the challenging side. The great news, I think, for all of you is it's going to give you unbelievable amounts of freedom, that didn't exist previously. I mean, it used to be that, you went to school in the Boston area, maybe got a job in the Boston area, you went to work in the Boston area, and, that's kind of how people kind of operated. I mean, I moved, and I encourage others in their career that they definitely should consider moving at different times, because I know it made me a much better leader, giving myself sort of exposure to different companies and different states and different places, and how people think, and kind of embracing kind of this diverse mindset, if you will. But you're going to have amazing opportunities where you're going to be able to be truly virtual in many cases, but it's going to put a premium on your work ethic. And I hope that everyone's kind of prepared for that transition, because it's going to be quite real. And something that it's going to be a bit of an experiment. I mean, 2020 and 2021 right now are kind of like the great years of for all of us at companies like ours, of testing new things. We're trying to figure out which of these things actually resonate with our employees. And this is closely related to the last one, the importance of developing good listening skills. I would say, it's funny, I consider myself a pretty forward-thinking, leader, but I'm just now really starting to become a better listener. And as you can see from this quote, there are a few specific skills that will help you understand people and help them feel safe and understood. And listening does both of those. And it's listening is such an underrated skill. We do a lot of coaching these days with sort of being sort of empathetic leaders, and EQ scores and things like that as leaders. We're trying to be better listeners, and I'll give you a good example of where I've kind of had some shortcomings in my own career in this area. And one of them is, like, I mentioned before about innovating and brainstorming. Like, I used to think that, you sat around a table and you kind of brainstormed, and everybody threw out ideas, and you kind of captured them as quickly as you could. And, and you put them up on a board, and you try to like figure things out and get feedback and adjust accordingly. And, it took me a while to realize that not everybody works like that. Like, a lot of people are more like deep thinkers. They need to kind of process information, they need to ponder it, and then come back with great ideas. And I think when I was at the Weather Channel, I realized for the first time, sadly, that that people think differently in that regard. And I think as a result of it, you kind of develop a certain, not just empathy, but a certain appreciation for the kinds of skills that different people bring. But the thing is, a lot of managers are slow to kind of learn these different things, and it's going to be incumbent upon you to kind of speak up sometimes and let people know that the way you process information might be a little bit different than how others do. But the key thing here is listening, not always speaking. And this doesn't mean that we don't want people to be kind of direct and things, but I think too often, I think sometimes people probably engage too much on the speaking side and not on the listening side. So empathetic leaders is kind of what we're really aspiring to have, and so I think you'll benefit from that. But it's also a skill that you're going to need to develop in your career. As I said before, hearing is accidental and voluntary and effortless. Listening is focused, voluntary, and intentional. And I think sometimes people think those are the same things. They're not. And so we it's an important skill as you're, thinking about, your choices of careers, and as you're leaving Bentley at some point, that you kind of develop some of these skills so you can be an effective employee. This is one that I shared my kids, is that mentors. This is an example of something where I just think I think there's such a misunderstanding here, that like the most important things I almost did in my career was to find mentors early. And this thing here, the delicate balance of mentoring someone is not creating them in your own image, but giving the opportunity to create themselves. And it's like, and when I think of this, I have three mentors right now. I've got this one guy, Rob, who is incredibly innovative and a thought leader, and highly regarded. I've got this other guy, Rob, who is more of like an HR person who works with board of directors and others and understands corporate culture and, and things like that. And I've got this other guy, Bill, who's kind of like a venture capital guy, and who gets involved in almost a little bit of everything. And I learned so much from them. But those are people who, in my work life, help me. I check in with them periodically. I kind of share with them kind of my challenges and stuff, and they help to sort of give me direction. And I'll tell you something about mentors too, because I think it's very common. My own kids deal with this, where people are reluctant to ask somebody to be a mentor. And let me say it this way: like almost every person I've ever known who's been asked to be a mentor, the vast majority, if they have time, say yes. And so, because the other side of this coin is that, this quote from Winston Churchill is that, we make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give. And I think, the way I look at these things is, if you start a new company, if you started a job in a new company, like, don't look for a mentor, in my opinion, in your own department. Find one in another department who's kind of highly respected and regarded, and learn from them. Learn where the landmines are in your corporation. Like, learn that culture issues that we talked about. Because it's there's no purpose, there's no point of kind of, stepping on all these problems that other people have already sort of solved. So in my mind, mentors are a great way to learn from those things. Kind of related to this is learning from your mistakes, and learning from others. And this is like, if there's anything I try to impart in my kids, this is one of them. And I highlight your, because taking responsibility for your mistakes is so important. And, I got one of my own kids who, I talk to on this issue sometimes, because it's so easy for all of us to sort of, shed responsibility. For those of you that are kind of leaving school shortly or things, take responsibility. I mean, companies, I know no one almost in my entire career who's ever been fired or reprimanded for taking responsibility for a mistake they made. Where you start getting into problems is when you start like developing a reputation for sort of, shedding responsibility and things. And so, and closely related to this one is learning from your mistakes. Another thing I oftentimes see, and I sure embark in your career, just give you sort of some words of advice, which is like, you can find inspiration, innovation almost anywhere. Too often people go to work and they kind of feel a little bit like, I think sometimes that, that the innovation is kind of what happens in those four walls that they're kind of surrounded by. And all you need to do is kind of open your horizons, right? And see kind of like, I know when I get to the Red Sox, they would often sort of compare themselves to the Yankees or Giants or Dodgers or somebody else. And we try to really kind of change that focal length and say, what's best in class? Like, what are our, our colleagues at Liverpool who, we've an ownership relationship with, what are they doing? What's best in class with Real Madrid? Or what are we doing in some of these other sports at the Olympics? And then what's best in class in industry? They're not always things that you want to necessarily apply at the same level in your company, but reinventing wheels is a waste of time. And I'll give you a quick funny example. Or I was inspiration can strike in the strangest places. I was I don't know how many years ago now, maybe 4. I was at a liquor store, and I don't know if you guys have seen those. Is it 19 Crimes, like wine? But they have this augmented reality thing where you can kind of download the augmented reality kind of app. I know none of you guys have been to a liquor store, but if you were to kind of hold that up to a bottle, the character in the front of it kind of animates and starts telling you a story. And I thought that was like really awesome. And that little interesting interaction kind of led to our augmented reality strategy. So now, if you hold up your phone to like our bobbleheads, they'll animate. If you go and look at our sort of Hall of Fame plaques, they'll tell you their story and things. So I guess my point there is open your mind to innovation and ideas, like, and don't be like too many people who get a little bit fixated on sort of kind of where some of these challenges, that they think that their challenges have all been solved in their respective companies. There's plenty left. And when in the spirit of, like, learn from your mistakes, I've been very fortunate in my career, and we've had a lot of successes, and I've had a lot of great teams, and I'll mention that a little bit. But this is something that I value. This is in my office, and that's a 32-bit PCI card that when I was at the Weather Channel, we were designing a localization device that allowed us to localize HD television, and that was like really hard to do at the time, especially at low price points. And so I found this company, I worked with them, we designed this board with them, and they kept missing their dates, they kept having problems, and the company was called Ingenious. They're not around anymore, so I'll use their name. But long story short, they failed. They closed up their operation, and that cost our company probably over $1 million, and probably 6 months of progress that we needed to make on sort of some of our localization technology and things. And I think about this one so much more than I think about the successes that we've had, because every time I am challenged with a difficult decision, I think about this and I think about other ones, and it really informs your thinking. We absolutely learn more from our mistakes and our successes, and I hope you guys do as well, both in school and kind of when you start your jobs. This other one, complacency is the enemy of progress, and perfect is the enemy of good. If you remember, Andy Grove, he was a former CEO of Intel. Success breeds complacency. Complacency breeds failure. Only the paranoid survive. I don't want you guys to go out into the market and think, oh my God, I gotta be paranoid about my job. But it is healthy a little bit to kind of have a certain level of, paranoia about sort of how quickly things change. I mean, look at COVID. I mean, look at all these sort of food delivery services. Like, you think anywhere on their business plans do they have like a hockey stick expectation that everyone's going to start ordering and having food delivered? Of course not. Or look at Zoom or Teams or any of the things that we're using nowadays, like exponential growth, right? I mean, things change incredibly quickly. And this new hybrid world that we're going to be living in very shortly is going to have a lot of changes to traditional businesses and how we operate. And it's funny, if you look at this, I mean, you guys are probably old enough to kind of remember Circuit City, but that's gone. I mean, effectively replaced generally by Amazon. I mean, Blockbuster, you can think of as, Netflix and a dozen other, streaming services. I mean, Dell's still around, but not the way it used to be. It used to be kind of the king of the hill relative to laptops and other things. And a lot of those have really moved to Apple in many cases. The Yellow Pages, it's kind of funny. I put the slide together years ago and I still use it because it's like, it's timeless in some respects. But the point here really in all of this is that things change, and complacency is kind of what we all sort of need to struggle against. At the Red Sox, like, we're all victims to it, right? I mean, the Weather Channel struggled with it. The one thing with the Weather Channel, another little lesson learned, is that we kind of had a philosophy at the Weather Channel of, because we were going through a time when websites just came out. So we were one of the largest top 10 websites in the world, and then mobility came out. And there were some that were reluctant to embrace mobility because they thought it was going to cannibalize sort of web, right? So we had, sometimes another way to think of it is think of television as it being measured in dollars, web being measured in maybe like dimes and quarters, and mobile being measured in like pennies. But the reality is that there's a lot of those pennies. And so we kind of embraced a portfolio strategy, kind of an and kind of philosophy, if you will. And that really kind of served us well. But even for the Red Sox, and we had this 10-year solid streak, right? And this is not about the Red Sox in terms of not kind of being complacent in some respects. It's kind of more about their technology, because when you become sort of comfortable with things like solid streaks, I know when I started in 13, we didn't even have a CRM. We knew so little about a season ticket holder. It was kind of scary. And we've really, to your point, for those that are data analytics majors and things, this really kind of set us on a course. We didn't have a data group in 2013. Isn't it shocking when you think about it? Like, you're like, wow. I mean, we had data within baseball that you might be familiar with, Moneyball and things, but we really didn't have a thoughtful data practice per se. And so a lot of this was an emphasis to us to really kind of like move forward at a much more rapid pace. And in order for us to move forward, we had to build teams, right? And this is another little lesson learned here for all of you. And that is like, I see so many mistakes being made. And this is a little bit more of a manager's perspective here. But you're both at a great time and a challenging time in some respects. You know, when I got out of Bentley and started working, I initially started working in the Boston area or New England area. And, but nowadays, you know, I think the one thing people are learning from COVID in a more of a virtual environment is you can find people almost anywhere. And I think the old days here is like, you know, this fish where the fish are. And people thought, you know, like you almost had to like go to Boston if you wanted to find talented tech and business people because there are a lot of colleges and universities here. Now I think leaders are starting to wake up to the realities of like find them where they are. You know, if your favorite place is Park City and you want to work there, then terrific. You know, I mean, fortunately for us is, and you know, when I was at the Weather Channel too, I mean, I have a, you know, our universe of people were scattered pretty widely, and on the technology side, and they still are. And so when we look for talent, we look a little bit of everywhere. I mean, we have a lot of relationships, so I will find students in different parts of the country that are doing, like we have someone doing some serum work in Baylor. We've got someone at UGA doing some things. I've had people in Virginia, certainly here in Boston, but all over the place doing little projects for us that kind of benefit our team. And those people, you know, oftentimes kind of become future employees of ourselves and our minor league franchises and things. But the point really in this one is, as leaders, you know, we're starting to fish in new locations here, and I think that creates both opportunity and a little bit of risk for all of us. And that you gotta probably raise your bar. You're not, you know, you're not just competing with people here in Boston or Massachusetts or New England. You're competing with people really kind of around the globe. And so as a result of that, you know, it's critical that you guys really kind of take, you know, your own careers in education is incredibly serious because it's a changing landscape. You know, in baseball, now I'll draw a parallel here. You know, I have always felt this way before I even came to the Red Sox, that building a successful team is what I consider the most important thing in my job. And when you're at work at like a baseball organization, this is kind of how I would sort of characterize successful sports franchises kind of work, right? You start off with kind of hopefully a, you know, a good farm system and future prospects. You've got some of these like marginal players. I'll say marginal, not meaning that they're not capable, but they're either on the way up or the way down. They're early stage like rookies, you know, or they might be some senior veteran that's maybe on the decline a little bit. You've got sort of specialists and like pinch hitters and, you know, runners and, you know, key talent folks. You've got a starting lineup. Hopefully you've got some all-stars, you got a coaching staff, and you got a general manager. When we build our teams, and like what I focus on, and I share this with you because I think others are kind of going this direction too. I hope it's helpful as you kind of start to think about your own position, you know, on the organizations that you ultimately find yourself on. You know, in IT, you know, part-time employees, interns, you know, competition, like we kind of look at our peers and we sort of figure out like, wow, who's really good in those other companies and things. There's a lot of movement in sports in part, you know, so we're constantly on the look, if you will. You know, this marginal player for us turns out to be kind of entry level, you know, resources, you know, legacy veterans. You know, we've got people who might be very complacent or comfortable in certain roles, and they might fill a very important role, but they're probably not as strategic to the success ultimately of our business in some ways. You know, we've got junior technology folks, subject matter experts, consultants. We ultimately have a starting lineup of our best and brightest, you know, and I would sort of include consultants in that as well. Hopefully we've got a few all-stars and, you know, a couple of key leaders who are, you know, paramount to the success of our business. You know, we've got coaches, and I would say player coaches, especially in technology. You'll find as you kind of graduate that most of the technology good leaders in my mind are kind of player coaches. They understand the technology, but they understand how to lead. And that's sort of a skill set that you want to sort of, I think, if that's a direction you want to go in, really kind of find and really kind of invaluable. And then ultimately, you've got someone who kind of leads a technology organization to kind of make it work. But all this has to work together in this. I mentioned like the diversity element too. It's like you want sort of both a complementary and a diverse world. And you know, in my career, we had a gentleman, I remember, his name is Mike, in one of my jobs, and this guy was really not the most enthusiastic person. And I remember I was at a staff meeting and he wasn't there that particular day. And the other members of my staff said, like, why do you kind of keep Mike? And I remember saying, I said, because Mike's kind of like the bullshit detector at our group. like he's not going to be, he's not jumping up and down, and he's not on the innovation side, but he's going to tell us where we make mistakes. And I bring it up in part because he and I are still friends, and it's also kind of like that you don't need just one type of person in your organization. You need this variety, and that variety creates innovation and spurs sort of enthusiasm, I think, with the organization. Embrace change. I contemplated putting this as the number one thing, but the most important thing you can really do is to embrace change, right? It's don't become complacent, don't be the person who, like, I don't know, like, we switched software development environments not too long ago. We were C#.NET shop, and we kind of moved to like Python, Django, and others things, and most of the vast majority of our group kind of took to it like fish and water. We provided mentoring and consulting and services and things. But like, I'll give you the Weather Channel, probably a better example. We moved probably 100 of our engineers from one software and development environment to another. And I'd say probably 85 made the change, but some didn't. And some, it's almost like they've learned a language and they just feel like they're done. And I just encourage you not to be that person, because it's the pace of change that you're going to experience in your career is going to be faster than mine. And I thought it was pretty quick. And I'll tell you something else is like, when I went out to FTD and worked with some of the venture capital companies, I remember one time somebody asked me a question of how long would it take for us to shut down our corporate headquarters in one city, move those people that are willing to make the move over to another city, and keep our technology working through the whole process. And I looked at all this and I said, about 9 months. And he goes, yeah, that's great. He goes, let's do it in 3. And I say that because sometimes you need to push to realize how fast you can move. I didn't know I could move that quickly or do the kinds of things that we did. Obviously you want to make intelligent, decisions and not make it too, risky. But, sometimes you need to work in different cultures and different climates to really kind of know what you're capable of. And so toward that end, I would really kind of encourage you to not just embrace change, but to really kind of, to kind of seek out sort of diverse, organizations that have different levels of enthusiasm about sort of how they operate their businesses and things. And last, and again, I keep saying most important, so I probably said it 4 times, but love what you do. It's like, we all spend so much time working, and it's funny, when my wife and I first met, I remember picking her up at school one time, and she was still finishing her college degree. And she said to me something like, oh, what we've been doing? I said, oh, I was kind of working. And she's like, and it was just funny. She goes, oh my God, you're like a workaholic. And I said, oh, I'm not a workaholic. It's just that my work is my hobby. and I think I've evolved to a point where I've sort of, work accordingly, especially with a family, and try to find the time to make sure that, we're sort of enjoying life and things like that. But if you're in your job, and you don't find that it's fun, or your career or something, like, go back to school, like build on your education, like, and things, because find the next job. It's like, especially if you're new at your role. Parents may not like hearing this, but like, I'm a big believer that, like, especially your early jobs, like, don't stay too long, because it's, as a manager who's hired a lot of people, if you come in at a certain number, pick a number for math, $50,000, right? You say you get a 5% increase, right? It's not a lot of money. You're there for 2 years. Like, you're probably still not even at 60. And I just find that, like, for people who are early stage type of thing, I really encourage them to, like, to think about a 2 to 3 year strategy for how they operate, unless they're the kind of company that's radically changing, because when you're young, you want to sort of learn what you're good at, and what you like and what you value. And I think that there's no better way of doing those things. And so hopefully some of these thoughts are beneficial to you as you're kind of embarking on your own respective careers. And but anyways, I'll pause at that. I can also, I'm more than happy. I know you get a lot of data analyst folks kind of, who are here. So I'm more than happy to, take questions or even sort of share some slides. And what I can also do is, I'm happy, Mark, to share with you some of my slides, or whoever's appropriate, and around analytics as well, so that, people can sort of take a look at those. And, I'll make sure you have my email address too, if you want to kind of fire off any questions you might like to me as well. So kind of with that, I'll pause for questions.
If you can stop sharing briefly so we can see each other, that would be great.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So I was on a roll. I can, hold on, give me a second.
There we go.
Beautiful.
Thank you. So if you have a question for Brian, first, please raise your hand and go. Or a comment. Otherwise, we'll ask. Otherwise, Brian's going to call on you and ask you questions.
Yeah, who's a data analytics person here? All right, Joe. There you go. So tell me, so what are you looking, what kinds of things you're looking at, Joe? What kind of, I mean, I think, by the way, I was advising one of my sons to go, to really kind of pursue data analytics, because to me, we're just at the nascent, we're just beginning, I mean, we're a big Google customer, and we've been, well, we are now. I mean, we moved to Google like last year, right in the midst of COVID. And by the way, one of the best decisions I ever made in my career. And now we're doing machine learning. We're doing some really sophisticated work, and I'm completely confident that at the end of this year, people are going to look back and wonder how we did things before we kind of fully moved to Google and the cloud and that type of thing. So but we're still early stage. When I think of analytics, it's like there's so much more we should and could be doing that we're not doing. For those that are data analytics majors, I don't know what you come out of school, what skills, but one thing I would just say about some students I've talked to is you definitely want to learn SQL if you haven't already. I mean, that's a prerequisite in my book, for folks that we hire and that we really consider sort of like thought leaders kind of in the spaces, or kind of going to jobs and things. We use Tableau, like a lot of companies, type of thing, but I mean, R is being used in certain places, but what the thing that's interesting about data analytics for me is all those things I said in those slides. It's like there's an area that you really need to understand your business, okay? Because it's your job as a data analytics person, or even as an IT developer, and those things too. It's not just sitting there waiting for someone to drop work on your table, right? It's really the best people are the ones that kind of go out there almost as analysts and figure out kind of where the company has needs. It's not always kind of like in the finance areas. And in fact, in our company, it seldom is. It's more often in sales. It's in areas of fan engagement. It's understanding trends. We're starting to pull in data through IoT or Internet of Things technology, right? Volumes of data that we could never even comprehend before, and those require all sorts of different kinds of skills and tools and things. I mean, we've got video cameras that capture 1,000 frames a second. So we've got 16 cameras, 8 on a pitcher and 8 on a batter, that generate tremendous volumes of data, mind-boggling amounts of data. And being able to analyze those things so that I can sort of discern, or someone can discern the difference between sort of, Chris Sale throwing at his best and when he's maybe not at his best. All these different things are kind of going on. And so the field of data is a rich one. And I think one that's really, really very much at sort of its infancy relative to kind of where it'll be in the next few years. So, I think it's exciting for those that have chosen that path. I think but don't become that person who just has a tool on their tool belt. You really kind of need to develop your sort of analysis skills. You really need to understand your company's culture if you're going to be ultimately successful. And you're going to need to evolve, because the tools are changing incredibly rapidly. Analytics tools that we use now are different than the tools we used 2 years ago.
Paul has a question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, good, Mark.
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question, kind of generally in the area that you were talking about there, about like the one thing that kind of stands out to me is that, like, as a Bentley student, I'm finding myself increasingly like emphasizing the fact that, like, I really enjoy data analytics and kind of the more technical side of things, but also I really like want a job that like really satisfies like my business interests and kind of all of that. And I was wondering, especially at a company that, like, functionally speaking, like, you have two separate camps of like people who are interested in winning and the business side of like running a franchise. So I was just kind of wondering how all that interacts.
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, we do actually have, two separate I'll say it this way. When I think of data in our company, I think of it as like three buckets, two really large ones and one smaller one. So we have traditional, what we call like, general administration kind of functions, HR, finance, things like that, that are kind of represent sort of almost like traditional internal corporate data. We sort of have all of our sports, baseball related data, and then we have data about fans, the game of, certain elements about baseball, but I'll say most about fans. And if you think about it, so in the center of these personas, and the center of this, I don't know my picture here. On this one over here, we have, the fan is in the center of it. And this one we have the employee, and over here we have the player, and the mindset around all of them though are actually kind of pretty remarkably similar. And we ingest a tremendous amount of data. A lot of it's at night on the baseball side. On the fan side, a lot of it's at night. But I'll tell you, it's interesting as analysts, many of you are analysts will learn, is that APIs are changing the world too. So much of what we used to consume was almost sort of very batch oriented, right? Like, okay, we play a game, I get a lot of data, we process the data, we consume the data, we generate reports, things like that. And that still goes on. I mean, that's kind of I'll call it meat and potatoes. Like now we're having conversations about like, I can get real-time updates on any single concession stand. And I can sort of look at my mobile device and find out whether they're ahead or behind sort of where you would expect them to be for a given night. And I can take a look at sort of what inventory levels are, and and I can sort of get a better sense for whether, if we're behind, whether it's a function of, the person working there or the function of the products that we're servicing and things. And we can make changes to kind of the product categories incredibly quickly. We can change menu boards, and things like this because of content management systems. So all of this stuff now is highly integrated. Baseball is a lot like that too, right? So we've got, in baseball, you're pulling in most of the data in baseball is overnight. We pull in a tremendous amount of data. And what people don't realize on the baseball side is that you're really kind of pulling in data for the entire league, not just your team. So we're constantly looking at sort of how we're performing, but we're also at the same time using all the same analytics and strategies, looking at every player in the league, honestly, because we never know when we're going to trade for them. You know what I mean? And so when they become a free agent and those types of things. And so we always have to always kind of know what the current state is. And we have the same thing going on with prospects. So we'll track, 2,000 prospects type of thing, around the globe with 135 scouts, and so we're constantly consuming information, video information, as well as other kind of metadata, about all these young players and their performance and things like that. And the tools that we're using to be able to collect those are changing too. So there's a whole, if you think of Moneyball, I'll call it Moneyball 1.0 is basically understanding everything there is about the player from a traditional sort of player performance perspective. Probably Moneyball 2.0 is a little bit more of, I think, as we're collecting all this information, the other new, area that's grown dramatically in the last 10 years is really around the health and wellness of the player, right? So I think you're going to find the ultimate success is going to be the combination of player performance meets sort of medical and wellness, right? So because now we know, like, how do we train players, right? And it's not just sort of traditional training, it's everything from behavioral, psychological, like, weight, reflexes, eyesight, mechanics, you name it, nutrition, on and on and on and on kind of thing. And a lot of those analytics, by the way, begin to tell us things too about like how somebody recovering from an injury. If you're a dead pull hitter to left field, and now suddenly your ball's going to right, well, maybe you still have a problem with your wrist, so we're using all this information to be able to kind of inform sort of our decision making. And I think we've got some of the best systems in sports to kind of do some of that work. And so there's great opportunities there for both kind of people on the data side, as well as kind of on the engineering side, to kind of continue to kind of build on these kind of rich tools and analytic products and things like that.
Sarah, you had your hand up before.
Yes. Hi, Brian. Thank you again for coming to speak to us. So my question was, if you feel your Bentley degree has been helpful. I know you said you started out with like software engineering, like more on that side. Do you feel it was like worthwhile to have that business background to complement like your experiences in the tech industry?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you say that because it's like I've hired hundreds of engineers in my career, and the challenge you run into oftentimes when I hire, like, so I've heard a lot of, when I was at the Weather Channel, I hired probably 85% of my staff were from Georgia Tech. down south. And a lot of them were really talented, but they were so singularly dimensioned. Like, they were good engineers, and so when I had some difficult software to write, they were really valuable. But the most valuable people for me, and I think this is going to become increasingly important, by the way, Red Auerbach, former, coach and general manager and president of the Celtics, had an expression. They asked him one time, like, what he looks for, and he says, good athletes. Right. So yeah, you can always find, not always find, but everyone needs a center, and everyone needs certain key roles kind of on a sports franchise type of thing. But more and more we need good athletes, because in a world where things are changing rapidly, sometimes having that person who's that 7-2 center is helpful. But, if you want to be a club that wants to run, suddenly they become a liability, and so I think what Bentley gave me was sort of a, kind of a kickstart a little bit. I mean, I kind of fell in love on the software side, so I probably didn't need a lot of motivation to continue to sort of evolve my skills. But the business side really, I think, gave me sort of another dimension that allowed me to kind of pretty early in my career be sort of a person that could both write the software, but lead departments, interview people, understand sort of their challenges, and ultimately, I guess, become probably a pretty adept problem solver.
Thanks. Luke, and then Brian.
Hello, I just wanted to ask, what are some of like the IT related projects that you've worked on since you've been at the Red Sox? Or like, do you have like a favorite one that you've worked on, or one that took a long time?
Really good question. I'll rattle off 3 or 4 of them. Like, we built an application called Beacon that is our baseball analytics, kind of the hub of all things baseball. That was a major effort. We worked with a local company, Slalom, to kind of do some of that work, and we're super proud of that work. And and that was difficult because before that we had Carmine. And Carmine was a system that was developed almost exclusively in some respects by like a couple people, and it was a great solution, but it was sort of a dated platform, and trying to modernize was challenging. So I feel really good about that. I'll tell you, we wrote a mobile gaming application, a bingo gaming application that we think is pretty cool. We get like 70, 80,000 users, during the course of a year. We're now licensing it in NCAA and NFL and, hockey leagues and things like that. So some of that stuff is being more broadly used and things, which is fun. I think our efforts on Google have just been, I couldn't be more pleased. They've really kind of exceeded our expectations in terms of what they're allowing us to do. A lot of firsts this coming year, like during COVID, and this is, again, about different companies you can go to work for. But one thing about baseball that's been really kind of fun is baseball a little bit, baseball has a mentality that's, that values time and tradition, right? So I think they sometimes look at COVID as sort of a business interruption, obviously a dramatic impact on our financial health, but during the same time period, we're upgrading to Wi-Fi 6. We'll be the first in baseball to do that. Whereas, we just implemented Verizon 5G. We've overhauled all of our point of sale technology. We moved to Salesforce. We moved to Google. All those occurred. The bulk of all those occurred really last year during COVID. And last year was an astoundingly successful year from a technology perspective, albeit challenging, obviously, with the lack of fans attending and things like that with COVID. So those are some of my personal favorites.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more. Ryan, and then
Brian. A kind of simple question. What is your mindset as you go into work every day, and how has that changed through each of your jobs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it varies, pretty widely depending upon the company I'm working at and the time of year. I mean, someone asked a question before we started about like, am I busier now that the season starts or before the season? And the answer is probably yes. Where it's kind of like a different kind of busy, right? So once you're in the season, you're kind of operationally busy because you're hosting games and you want to do a good job for fans. But for us, we're probably busier in some ways off season. And that like we work like in a very kind of seasonal mindset because it's difficult to implement dramatic change during the middle of a year. I mean, or, we can only do so many things. So like once a season's over, we have a big focus on what we're going to do for opening day the following year, and so we might implement some things during All-Star break, And we continue to implement new technologies, but a lot of the fan-facing things, you have to have them somewhat fully baked by the time you get toward opening day in order to be highly successful.
Joe.
So I just want to know how you like leverage your Bentley degree with Corona being, making the job market so hard to get jobs these days. How do you really leverage your degree to actually stand out to like companies like that are in the sports business analytics field?
Yeah, it's good. So you're asking for someone like yourself who's graduating in the near
Right.
future, like how do you differentiate yourself? I think part of it's sort of, like making sure you've got like a rich set of skills. If you're a data analytics kind of person, like I would also learn Tableau, at least develop like basic understanding of it, right? I mentioned SQL before. I mean, every job's a little bit different. What's interesting with some of those jobs, like on the analytics side, I mean, understanding sort of like databases in general. I mean, I'm still surprised by the number of people, like when I graduated, software development was still sort of evolving, and we didn't have the same emphasis we do today on front end development and the quality of the applications that we developed. We didn't have mobile apps that really kind of raised the bar with kind of expectations. I would say that the most important thing is to be grounded on your tech skills. Especially understanding data schemas, relational database design structures. Probably being cognizant of kind of like what's going on in the industry, like who are the players, what's the difference between different solution spaces and things. What are people doing to kind of solve problems and things like that. But on the Bentley side, I would say, I hope, and I would, just from knowing some Bentley faculty, I'm pretty confident this exists, but like, don't underestimate sort of the value you derive from having sort of a more rounded background. Like, as I said before, I have a tendency to hire people who I consider like good athletes over people who sometimes come in who can, rewrite an operating system. Like, it's kind of like, those are like interesting skills. And I know the person's smart and things, but they sometimes, I'd rather have a Swiss Army knife than somebody who's like a sharp knife that I can use when I need to cut something, So I think, having a broad business background and also being able to kind of, it's more than just, as I said before, like whether you're a developer or you're a data analyst kind of role type of thing, it's so much more than just expecting someone like your boss or others to just give you work, right? It's like I encourage people all the time, because one of the wonderful things about the data analytics side is that you have access to all this data. So like, if you understand the company, you understand what's driving the company, you should be able to start doing some stuff behind the scenes. You don't need to be told to do it, right? Whether you're doing it kind of part-time on your own and stuff, I encourage people all the time, you tell me what you think would be a good application. This business, our challenges, I think, Joe, that, when you're well positioned, I think getting the first job is always gonna be hard. Really just being realistic. I don't know in terms of like how best to differentiate. I think having a rounded background, trying to get internships is obviously a good hedge where you can, type of thing. I've encouraged my kids, I told my kids sometimes that like when they were in college that I didn't honestly care if they got paid for their internships as long as they learned. So to me, the learning part is more important than the money part. Now, not everyone has that ability to be able to say those kinds of things, but to me, it's like, doing anything you can do to kind of, create, do your own work or pull down data. If you want to be like, we have people sometimes who will send us things, says, I pulled in all the data that's available from MLB, and I've done some of my own analytics, like, as a way of sort of proving sort of their prowess in terms of understanding sort of like baseball data, and things like that. And not everyone has the time to do that, but when people do things like that, it makes a difference. It's not uncommon for a student to send me something saying, hey, I did this, and I'd love to work with you guys. Like, what do you think? And so I think those kinds of things can resonate with folks. The other thing I would just say, one thing is to look at Indeed and some of these other like websites, and things. Look what people are hiring. Like, what I mean? Take a look at sort of what those skills are and match them up against your own and see whether you're kind of keeping pace. I wouldn't rely, you're in college now, and it's a little bit different than when I was. It's like professors have curriculum, you guys, but things change much more quickly than any professor can sort of, convert their course to a new skill or new tool. So it's some of it's incumbent upon you to kind of probably be a little bit more proactive than I think it might have been in the kind of years past.
Hickey, Topi, the chair of the CS department. Welcome.
Thanks, Mark. And Brian, thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. That's wonderful. I have a question related to something you mentioned a couple of times about the entrepreneurial approach to work, and particularly in analytics, just exploring things and discovering opportunities, and maybe identifying that next very popular app and such. Being able to do that requires access to data and requires freedom to use resources in certain ways. And I was just curious to hear how you have set the boundaries within your organization in terms of access to data, depending on these typical job responsibilities or maybe experience within the organization and such. How do you determine who has the access, who is trusted with certain data and such?
Yeah, great question. So maybe kind of two questions. I'll sort of blend them a little here. So I probably a little bit more liberal policy. I have kind of a bit of a trust but verify kind of mindset. We classify our data, so we wouldn't start off by giving somebody access to medical data, for example, or HIPAA kind of things like that. But a lot of the data in sports, like especially on the sports side, and I don't mean like say scouting data, but just general data, is available to all of us, right? That's readily available kind of information. Scouting related information, we're probably a little bit more focused. We also, one of the things we'll do sometimes in certain areas too, for people who might have been interested in exploring things, is we'll anonymize data. So it's not uncommon where we'll take the player out of it and let someone do analysis, or take the fan out of it and let someone do analysis against data, not necessarily knowing who the person is, in certain cases. And I think that's becoming much, much more common too, because, to your question, which I think is a really, really good one, it's like I very much encourage like our employees to kind of, I think one thing that's changed in my career too is, you used to think about it like people used to take forever to do requirements, and and Hickey, this, like it used to be like they do all these requirements and they gather them and they do some analysis and they do some design work, and then they show it to the person who's requested it, and the person, that's not what I'm looking for, and so we've radically accelerated all that, right? So we do rapid prototyping at the very beginning and things like that. But these tools now are so relatively easy to use that, like, I incredibly encourage people, whether you're a developer, data analyst, or some other roles in technology, like go ahead and sort of create like your own little app or fictitious app. It doesn't have to write all the code behind the scenes. You can just do the shell of the app kind of thing, like prototype things. Because I think that one challenge that humans have is I have a firm belief that we as technologists have a burden sometimes where we almost have to get things to like 80% oftentimes before companies want to kind of jump in with us. It's like if you're starting at zero with some good notes on a whiteboard and you go, oh my God, I get this brilliant idea. And you start like drawing pictures and connecting circles and diagrams. Most departments, like they're not wired like maybe some of us are. They're kind of like, that seems complicated. That seems risky. Like, I'm not on board with this. But when you prototype things, when you do sort of some of these, you leverage some of these tools to really kind of create pseudo apps and things, and even be able to take sort of like anonymized data. Requesting anonymized data is a very common request. So that's, sometimes take a little bit of work to kind of make it happen. But to do those kinds of things, like I look at that as like that the person's trying to learn. So to me, I look at those as a way to kind of bypass some of the security concerns that I have, yet allow the person to sort of innovate, I guess is the way I kind of think of it a little bit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody for your questions, and Brian for your talk today. Brian, is it okay if we paste your LinkedIn link in the chat so those want to follow, you can do that?
Yeah, of course. Absolutely.
Okay. Let me do that.
Yeah,
and I want to ask,
I'm sorry, Mark, to interrupt you, but for those that are, I'm happy to, any questions you have, I'm happy to give you, further insights, you can reach out to me via LinkedIn. These guys have my email address too. I'm happy to chat with you guys and give you my advice or whatever I can. I didn't get into all the analytics stuff that we do, and I'm happy to kind of I can leave with Mark sort of hint some slides that might help tell a better story for some of those that are a little bit more deeply focused in those areas.
Thank you, and we can post those as well. I'll follow up with you about that. I want to ask Sarah to share her screen for a sec. Sarah's been doing all of our promos for the Topics in Tech series this year. And I want to introduce this week as our doubleheader week. We have you today. Felicia is a researcher at Twitter. She graduated from Bentley in 2017 with a bachelor's in marketing and a minor in CIS. And she is now a audience insights team researcher at Twitter. And she's going to talk about how people make sense of tweets, especially in the entertainment and dining industries. Her presentation is tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And then next week, on Wednesday, the last series is Philip Desautel, who will be talking about Internet of Things, smart cities, and smart devices. So that will wrap up our series for the season. So please join us if you can. Thanks for being here, and have a great afternoon.